The live broadcast of American Voices unfolded in Washington, D.C., beneath a canopy of stage lights, booming microphones, and perfectly cued laughter from a packed audience of over 200. It was familiar territory, structured, polished, predictable, and for Jasmine Crockett, that predictability was power. She emerged from backstage not as a guest, but as a champion. Clad in a dark navy blazer, her hair tied back neatly, her expression sharp and assured, Jasmine exuded control. This wasn't about participation, it was about domination. From her first words, she seized the moment. Her delivery was steady and seasoned, each anecdote peppered with humor and calculated pauses that drew out just the right bursts of laughter from the crowd. When host James Whitaker posed a question about the growing generational divide, Jasmine responded with a casual shrug and a line that cut deep. Some kids grow up with ideals. Others just grow up with privilege. The audience burst into applause. Heads nodded. The agreement in the room was instant and unquestioning. Seated beside her, Karoline Leavitt remained quiet. Dressed in a high-neck white blouse, without jewelry or flair, she listened, motionless. She didn't argue or interrupt. She barely blinked. Eventually, James turned to her. "Karoline, what's your take on that?" Her answer was calm and cool. "That comment wasn't for me." The room fell silent, briefly. Jasmine smiled, as if she'd landed her first punch. From that moment on, the energy shifted, subtly but unmistakably, in Jasmine's favor. The cameras lingered on her. James echoed her points. Audience reactions came more quickly, more enthusiastically, whenever Jasmine spoke. She felt it. She fed on it. Her words quickened, edged with a new sharpness. Then came the jab. Sometimes people get on TV not because they have something valuable to say, but because they're young, have nice hair, and know how to please the boss. Just kidding. She laughed. The audience didn't. Karoline forced a smile, her eyes flickering. "I think we all know that was just a joke, right?" No one replied. The camera, as if by instinct, drifted to the third row. There sat Robert Leavitt, Karoline's father, in a modest gray suit with a small hammer-shaped pin, a quiet nod to decades spent in New Hampshire construction. His gaze, steady and unreadable, fixed on Jasmine. It wasn't angry, but it landed heavy. Still unaware, Jasmine pressed on, voice confident but knife-sharp. And sometimes people rise fast, not because of experience, but because they match an image someone powerful wants to project. James tried to chuckle, to pivot the show forward. "Let's talk about the role of young women in politics, Jasmine." The tension was thick now. Karoline didn't answer. She stared at the table. Her hands, once rhythmically tapping, were still. Her eyes met her father's. He hadn't moved, but in that gaze was every conversation they'd ever had about dignity, effort, and the cost of shortcuts. His words echoed in her mind. "You don't inherit respect. You earn it." Jasmine's offhand joke had struck a deeper nerve than she realized. The crowd felt it too. The clapping waned. A few audience members looked at their phones. One typed furiously, maybe double-checking that the shift in tone was real. On stage, James buried his head in his cue cards, as if hunting for an escape from a segment that had slipped its leash. But the camera didn't flinch. It lingered on the quiet man in row 3, gray suit, silver hair, a face weathered by labor and time. His silent presence now said more than anyone on stage. Jasmine was beginning to notice. Her once commanding smile wavered. It didn't disappear, but it lost its edge. She looked toward Karoline, then to the audience. Something had changed. And for the first time that evening, Jasmine wasn't sure she owned the room anymore. When Jasmine's eyes landed on the man in the third row, though she didn't yet know who he was, something inside her stilled. It was as if she'd crossed an invisible line she hadn't known existed, and now there was no way to turn back. The room held its breath. No one spoke. No rebuttals, no shifting music to smooth over tension, just silence, thick and sharp, cutting through the moment like glass. What moments ago had passed as a clever, cutting joke now lingered in the air like something more serious, more personal. The energy shifted, and so did Jasmine's awareness. The cameras kept returning to her, lingering as if waiting for something, an acknowledgement, a stumble, a revelation. James Whitaker, trying to appear neutral, still leaned ever so slightly toward Jasmine's rhythm, as if her confidence pulled him closer. The audience, whether out of bias or curiosity, kept reacting in her favor. That response, however faint, emboldened her. Her pace quickened. Her words, though polite, carried barbs. "Let's be honest," she said. "Some people get airtime not because of their ideas, but because they're young, attractive, and good at repeating what's popular." She didn't name anyone. She didn't have to. Everyone understood, especially Karoline. Karoline glanced at Jasmine, expression unreadable, voice withheld. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her pen down on the glass table. The gesture was simple, but precise, as if she knew something Jasmine hadn't realized yet. Again, the camera swept across the audience, briefly catching the man in the third row. It paused for less than a second. No one noticed. Jasmine didn't either. A new question followed, this time about how media portrays women in politics. James tossed it toward Jasmine with a grin still chasing the last laugh. "Jasmine, have you ever felt misunderstood just for being a woman?" She didn't miss a beat. "Of course," she replied. "But I'm misunderstood more often for refusing to apologize when I speak the truth." Applause followed. A young woman nodded. Someone tapped something quickly into their phone. But something in the room had shifted. Not because her words were wrong, but because something no longer felt entirely right. Jasmine's certainty began to cool. Her attention, once firmly on James, started to flick toward Karoline. Not out of fear, but out of curiosity. Was the silence still holding? Karoline hadn't spoken, but she wasn't watching Jasmine anymore. Her eyes were locked, steadily, unblinkingly, on the man in the third row. No lights shone on him. No title was read. He was simply there, seated among the audience of American Voices. The show had its structure. The talkers, the listeners, the cues, the applause. Everything followed its script. Until it didn't. Because Jasmine said one more thing. A throwaway line. A laugh. She thought she still owned the rhythm. She didn't notice when the man lifted his eyes. From that moment on, the story slipped quietly out of her hands. James tried to redirect. "Let's talk about representation," he said. "How do you respond to those who feel ignored by today's political system?" Jasmine leaned forward, hands clasped, her voice soft, almost gentle. "I think people have every right to feel unheard. But sometimes, I wonder, are they really left behind? Or have they been given a path and still believe it's not enough?" A few chuckles rose, tight, uncertain. Karoline frowned. She looked down at the table again. Then came Jasmine's final remark. "Let's be real. Some people get into politics not because of their ideals, but because they fit a moment, a campaign, a narrative. They're chosen, not because they're ready, but because they're young and convenient." It wasn't said with malice. It felt like a light aside, a casual observation. "Just kidding," Jasmine added with a soft laugh. This time, the audience didn't laugh with her. Not really. James hesitated. His smile faltered. Then he turned to Karoline. "Karoline, care to respond?" Karoline didn't speak right away. She looked at Jasmine for a long moment, then blinked slowly, deliberately. Finally, she turned her gaze outward, toward the audience. Her silence was no longer passive. It was preparation. At that precise moment, the camera shifted, and for the first time, everyone truly saw him. Third row, center. An older man in a modest gray suit, sitting upright, his back never touching the chair. His hands rested calmly on his knees, unmoving. His eyes, unwavering, were fixed solely on Jasmine. Robert Leavitt, Karoline's father. He didn't flinch. He didn't frown. But his stillness spoke louder than any outburst ever could. The silence around him wasn't empty. It was dense, almost physical. Jasmine began to feel it. She didn't know why, not yet. But something had changed. She laughed, a half-hearted attempt to recover. "I know I can be a little blunt sometimes, but maybe Americans could stand to be a bit less sensitive." No one laughed. Not a chuckle, not a shift in the front rows. Even the usual rustle of the audience had gone quiet. Karoline didn't move either. She wasn't looking at Jasmine. She wasn't looking at the host. She was staring at her father. Her eyes seemed to ask him something unspoken. "What do I do now?" The camera returned to James Whitaker. He looked visibly unsettled, flipping through his notes as if searching for the next line, but nothing on the page could prepare him for this moment. There had been no cue card for silence that hurt this much. Jasmine let out a slow breath. The room wasn't turning on her, it was pulling away. Not with rejection, but with reflection. No one had clapped back. No one had challenged her. And yet, somehow, the room was no longer hers. Then, quietly, Karoline spoke, not to Jasmine, but to everyone. "My father is in the audience today." All eyes turned. Robert Leavitt didn't move. No acknowledgement, No reaction. Just presence. Still, steady, enduring. Jasmine followed their gaze and looked at him. Their eyes met. No one could say how long it lasted. For Jasmine, it felt like falling, slow, helpless, and with nothing to grab onto. James didn't interrupt. Maybe he understood. Or maybe he was wise enough to know when to say nothing at all. Karoline placed her hand gently on the table. Not to draw attention, not to perform, just to anchor herself. Something inside her was rising. And this time, she wouldn't keep it down. I grew up in a house where my father had to prove himself every single day. People would ask him, "What makes you think you deserve that job?" And when he said he worked for it, they'd say, "But you don't have the right connections, do you?" There was no applause. No violin in the background. Just her voice, clear and even, cutting through the air like a blade. So when someone turns opportunity into a punchline, right in front of the man who never got a shortcut, maybe it's just a joke to them. But to my family, it's a scar that never really healed. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't fire back. She just looked at Karoline. Really looked, trying to see past the words to whatever truth lay beneath them. Her confidence hadn't vanished, but it had thinned. Karoline leaned forward slightly, as if about to continue, but the camera didn't stay on her. It had begun to drift toward the audience, toward something unspoken but rising. In that moment, the crowd was no longer just spectators of a live broadcast. They were witnesses, not to a debate, but to a reckoning. And somewhere in their minds, a question began to echo. If I laughed because I thought it was just a joke, did I help keep that wound open? Robert Leavitt hadn't moved. Still upright, still silent. But the silence itself was different now. It had a shape, a weight, the kind that made breathing feel just a little harder. She looked at her father, her eyes filled with silent turmoil, as if asking without words, "What do I do now?" The camera cut back to James Whittaker. He looked unmoored, as though someone had torn the script from his hands. Nothing had prepared him for this. There had been no cue card for this kind of silence. The kind that doesn't fill a void but creates one. Jasmine let out a breath. Not because someone confronted her, but because no one did. That silence didn't protect her. It unsettled her. It made the ground beneath her certainty shift. And then Karoline spoke, not to Jasmine, but to the room. "My father is in the audience today." Heads turned toward the third row. Robert Leavitt remained still. No nod, no shift in posture. He didn't need to move. Jasmine turned too. Their eyes met. The moment held. For how long? No one could say. But to Jasmine, it felt like a slow descent, with no ground in sight. And for the first time that night, she said nothing. James didn't cut in. Whether he understood the gravity or not, he stayed silent. Karoline gently placed her hand on the table, not to fidget, not to perform, but to steady something rising inside her. "I grew up in a family where my father was asked, nearly every day, 'What have you done to deserve that position?' And when he answered, 'I've worked my whole life in construction,' they'd reply, 'But you don't have the right connections, do you?' No applause. No music. No interruptions. Just her voice, steady and clean. Each word settled into the silence like a weight. So today, when someone treats opportunity like a punchline, in front of my father, it might sound like a joke. But for us, it's an old wound. One that never really closed." Karoline didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She simply spoke, her words carving their way through the quiet like truth always does, without needing to shout. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, as if she might respond. But the camera had already shifted away from her. Because at that moment, this wasn't about rebuttals or retorts. The audience had ceased to be passive spectators. They had become witnesses, witnesses not to a debate, but to something deeper. A moment of reckoning. And in that quiet reckoning, a silent question surfaced in many minds. If I laughed when it was just a joke, did I help keep that wound open? The camera landed again on Robert Leavitt, his face weathered by years, lined with quiet dignity. He still hadn't moved. He didn't avert his eyes. He didn't frown or shake his head. He didn't need to. His silence spoke with the force of a lifetime. And that's when Jasmine began to feel the weight of it all. The usual explanations, "I didn't mean it that way. It was just a joke." People are too sensitive began to feel small. Not because someone refuted them, but because, under the weight of his silent gaze, they collapsed on their own. Jasmine's hand gripped the edge of the table lightly. She had faced critics, sparred with journalists, argued in high-stakes rooms. But now, she didn't know where to look. She glanced at James. He was studying his notes, or maybe just avoiding her eyes. The air in the studio had changed. Not louder, quieter. So quiet that even the soft tap of Karoline's pen touching the glass table rang out like a knock at a door no one wanted to answer. And then Robert Leavitt stood. No fanfare. No sound. Just one hand pressing against his knee as he rose, calm and unwavering. The room seemed to exhale, only to realize it had been holding its breath. Jasmine instinctively leaned back. Not out of fear, but uncertainty. She didn't know what to say, what to feel, what this moment required of her. Robert didn't move toward the stage. He didn't speak. He just stood there, hands calmly at his sides, eyes fixed on Jasmine. Not accusing, not condemning, just present. Fully, unavoidably present. It was all he had to do. And in that presence was a quiet demand. Face this. Sit with it. Don't run from it. The audience began to stir, uneasily. People glanced at one another, not for answers, but for reassurance. As if unsure what they were feeling, but certain that something important was unfolding. An assistant leaned toward James and whispered, likely a cue to move on. But no one moved. The camera remained locked on Robert. Every line on his face, every strand of silver hair, existed not as performance, but as reflection. He wasn't performing outrage. He was a mirror, and anyone who looked could see something of themselves staring back. Jasmine turned toward Karoline. For the first time since the conversation began, they weren't opponents. They were simply two women, one speaking her truth and the other listening for hers. And in that shared silence, Jasmine thought of her own father. Not to compare, but to remember. He once told her, speak the truth, but never forget who's listening. What he didn't teach her was how to speak truth without creating scars. Now, standing in that room, before another father, a silent one, she was learning that lesson. James tried to regain control. His voice cracked slightly as he said, we'll move on to the next segment of the show. But his words were faint. No one objected. Yet no one was listening either. Because Robert, just standing there, had become the center of gravity. And his silence had done what no argument could. It made everyone in that room examine their own. Karoline placed her hand over her heart, then lowered it. Her gaze met Jasmine's. There was no anger. No invitation for forgiveness. Just a question. Can you look back? And for a moment, Jasmine didn't know if she could. No one saw it, but Jasmine gave a slight nod. Only she knew she had. And then, quietly, Robert Leavitt sat down. No applause. No cue for relief. Just the stage lights dimming ever so slightly, as if they too understood. This moment didn't belong to any one person. It belonged to the truth. And truth doesn't ask to be celebrated. It only asks to be seen. When Robert took his seat again, something in the room settled with him. No one demanded silence, yet no one dared to break it. Jasmine leaned back in her chair. She said nothing. James tried to guide the show forward, to reach the next segment. But the rhythm had shifted. The show no longer belonged to the script. Then Karoline began to speak. I thought I understood my father, she said softly. Until one night at dinner, I overheard my mother say he'd been called an uneducated builder, after working 30 years to provide for us. The room remained still. The camera didn't pan dramatically. It simply adjusted focus, as if instinctively drawn toward what mattered. He never told me that story, Karoline continued. I asked him, why didn't you? And he said, because I didn't want you to carry bitterness. I wanted you to carry light. A soft breath rose from the audience. Not emotion recognition. A quiet murmur inside people's hearts, like something unspoken had just been voiced. Karoline paused, not because she was unsure, but to give the room time to catch up. I used to think my father was too hard, too strict. But when I was 16, I watched him speak at a land use hearing. He was the only one in the room without connections, without clout, and he didn't back down. Not once. Later, I asked, weren't you scared? He smiled and said, I'm not afraid of their silence. I'm afraid of mine. In that moment, the audience didn't see a politician. They saw a daughter. A memory. A truth that didn't need to be argued. It only needed to be heard. And Jasmine turned. Her face wasn't defensive. It wasn't hard. For the first time that evening, she wasn't focused on how she was being seen. She was simply listening. Karoline continued, her voice even and full of quiet resolve. When I entered politics, my father didn't congratulate me. He just said, you won't be hurt by harsh words. You'll be hurt by the ones spoken like no one's listening. Then, she looked directly into the camera. Today, someone spoke about opportunity like it was a joke. But here's what I ask. Remember, every joke has an audience. And sometimes that audience is someone who never speaks up. The words didn't echo, they settled. A ripple, invisible but deeply felt, moved through the room. People sat straighter. A few nodded. A subtle shift, not an opinion, but an understanding. No one apologized to Jasmine. No one applauded Karoline. But something had shifted, not with applause, but with clarity. James glanced at the audience. The script in front of him suddenly irrelevant. His voice was low, steady. Sometimes, the most important things aren't found in the questions. Jasmine didn't respond, but she tilted her head ever so slightly, as if acknowledging, not conceding, not retreating, but sharing the weight of what had just been said. And in the third row, Robert Leavitt sat quietly. For the first time, a small, almost imperceptible smile appeared on his face. Not a smile of pride or triumph, just quiet understanding. And in that moment, American Voices wasn't just a show. It became something far more rare, a portrait of a nation pausing to listen to things never spoken, truths long buried, wounds rarely acknowledged. Karoline said nothing else. She looked down, eyes shining not from tears, but from something deeper. She repeated her father's words. He's not afraid of their silence. He's afraid of his own. It was no longer a political statement, not persuasion, not performance, just a memory, a reflection, a mirror held up to the room, and to anyone who ever thought this wasn't about them. Jasmine didn't argue. She didn't defend. She turned slowly, deliberately. And for the first time, her gaze rested not on herself, but on the space between them. Between her and Karoline. Between a joke and its consequences. Between silence and what it dares us to see. She listened. And maybe, just maybe, began to understand. A quiet ripple moved through the room. Not a sound, just a shift. People sat a little straighter. A few subtle nods, as if something unspoken had finally been named. Then, something unexpected happened. No one apologized to Karoline. No one rushed to defend Jasmine. But something intangible, yet undeniable, tilted toward Karoline. Not with applause. With awareness. For the first time all evening, James Whittaker spoke without glancing at his script. Sometimes, the most important things we say aren't answers to questions. Karoline didn't reply. She simply tilted her head, not in agreement, but in quiet solidarity, as if she was inviting everyone in the room, including Jasmine, to carry the story with her. And at that moment, Jasmine lowered her head slightly, not out of guilt, but perhaps, just perhaps, in acknowledgement, that there were things she hadn't considered. Robert Leavitt sat still, and for the first time that night, a faint smile crossed his face. Not triumphant, not emotional, just enough to show he had seen what he needed to see. In that moment, American Voices stopped being a talk show. It became something more honest, more raw, a reflection of the country itself, where one person spoke wrongly, one chose silence, and one shared a memory so it wouldn't be forgotten. No one was asked to stand. There was no swelling music. James bowed his head and thanked the guests, his voice softer than usual. Everyone in that studio walked away having felt something both personal and profoundly shared. And then, the video aired. It didn't explode online. No viral caption. No dramatic thumbnail. Just a long, quiet conversation with no clear hero and no one storming off the set. 12 hours later, a journalism student posted the clip from her small account. The caption read, "Not because she was strong, but because she spoke of pain without asking anyone to cry." Then came another post. This one from a white father in Virginia. "I used to laugh at those, just joking remarks. Now, I teach my son to never say them without knowing who's in the room." From there, the video began to spread, not like breaking news, but like a story whispered over coffee. Quietly, persistently, across classrooms and kitchens and corners of the internet. On Reddit, someone wrote, "The moment Jasmine laughed and turned to Karoline, that was the moment privilege forgot it wasn't invisible." Another user posted simply, "He stood up, and we never saw Jasmine the same way again." Major outlets didn't jump on the story, but one late-night show aired a 1-minute silence. No commentary, no laughter, just a replay of the moment Robert Leavitt stood, then sat. Still, silent, powerful. In a high school sociology class in Seattle, a teacher played the full clip. There was no lecture, no assignment, just one handwritten question passed around afterward. What makes someone change a room without saying a word? Many students answered the same way. Because he was a father. One student wrote, Because he didn't accuse. And he didn't excuse. Another said, because it was the first time I saw a man who didn't have to explain his feelings. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett disappeared from the media for a few days. Not because she was canceled, not because she apologized, but because, for once, she chose not to speak. Her team released a single line. Jasmine is taking time to reflect and be with her family. No one knew if it was a PR move or something real. But she didn't frame her comments as misunderstood. She let them echo, however they would be received. Some said she hadn't changed. Others said that saying nothing was the first step toward change. Karoline Leavitt never brought up the show again. But 3 days later, she posted a single photo not of herself, but of her father. A candid shot backstage. Robert Leavitt, sitting alone in a quiet hallway after the taping. No phone, no entourage, just the dim light glinting off his silver hair. The caption read, "He doesn't need to be believed. He just needs to be seen." The post didn't go viral, but it was printed and hung in the office of a high school principal in Philadelphia, a woman who had once been mocked by students for her soft voice. Beneath the photo, she wrote, "I don't need to be loud to have authority. I just need to be silent long enough for them to hear the emptiness in their own words." At a small church in Alabama, a pastor referenced the moment in his Sunday sermon. He didn't name the show. He didn't quote the dialogue. He simply said, "Sometimes, the most powerful thing a man can do is stand up and say nothing at all." Faith doesn't always come from the one who speaks perfectly. It often comes from the one who says nothing and yet inspires you to do what's right. Even in politics, where every word is rehearsed, polished, and often weaponized, a quiet phrase began to ripple across party lines. Someone stood up. No explanation needed. Everyone knew who it referred to. No party. No label. Just presence. Jasmine Crockett never issued a public apology. But in a later podcast interview, when asked, "Do you regret anything this year?" she paused for 3 long seconds, then replied, "I wish I'd realized a father was sitting in that audience." And maybe not every line deserves to be a joke just because I'm the first one laughing. There was no applause, but no one brushed past it either. At a TEDx forum in Colorado, a high school student stood on stage and said, "I don't want to grow up always being right. I want to grow up knowing when to stop." Somewhere in the room, that line landed differently, because someone, once, had chosen to stop, and others had quietly watched and learned. No one declared Karoline the winner. No judges, no scorecards. Just a conversation that ended with a room forever changed. There were no cheers, no standing ovations. People simply stood up, not to celebrate, but to reflect, to reframe what they once dismissed as just a joke, to remember those who never raised their voice, but still changed everything. Backstage, someone captured a candid photo of Karoline, sitting alone. No phone, no aid, just her, quietly looking down at the notes she'd once laid on the table. A freshman journalism student who took the photo captioned it, "I used to think strength meant never being wrong. Last night, I met someone strong enough to admit they were." The following week, no headline celebrated her. No campaign seized the moment, but something began to shift, especially among young people, educators, and professionals online. The phrase, "just a joke," started to disappear. Quietly, organically, people who once ended offhand remarks or awkward moments with "just kidding" stopped saying it. No one told them to. It simply didn't fit anymore. At a small bookstore in Chicago, a photo of Robert Leavitt standing during the taping was printed and taped behind the register. It had no caption. When a customer asked why, the owner replied, "Because I want people to be quiet when they see it." A week later, on a completely different talk show, a conservative guest began referencing the familiar joke about youth and unearned opportunities. But the host, without hesitation, gently interrupted, "Sorry, we've had a conversation that taught us some things just don't belong in the humor section anymore." The guest went quiet. The audience didn't cheer, but something shifted. For the first time, someone didn't let it slide. Jasmine didn't return to the spotlight to revisit the moment. She didn't issue a statement or post a reflection. She simply kept working. But something changed. After each hearing, she began closing her notebook, pausing, and looking directly at the room for 3 full seconds before leaving. She never explained why, but those who had been in the audience that night understood. She was leaving space for people to hear their own words. At a nonprofit educational organization, an internal memo anonymously circulated. It read, "Progress doesn't always come through rebuttals. Sometimes it comes when someone pauses, listens, and chooses not to continue. By the second week, people stopped quoting what Jasmine had said that night. But they never forgot the man who stood up. In Arizona, a 12-year-old student, child of an immigrant laborer, emailed Karoline's office. "You didn't yell, but I know you were angry. And so was I. Thank you for not arguing." I think not arguing is the strongest way to stand up for yourself. And just when the moment seemed to be fading, a new video quietly surfaced. Backstage, before the show, Karoline had been sitting beside her father. She leaned over and whispered, "If I don't say anything, will you be disappointed?" Robert placed a hand over hers, smiled, and replied, "You don't need to say anything. The ones who truly listen will hear the silence." One show, one comment, one man who stood, one woman who didn't try to win, just chose to let others see. The story didn't spread because it was dramatic. It spread because of its quiet power. On forums and message boards, people began sharing personal stories. A woman in Ohio posted, "I used to laugh when coworkers joked about easy success. Now I wonder who I overlooked." A student in Boston wrote, "Robert's silence reminded me of my grandfather, who worked every day of his life and never asked to be noticed." In Miami, an elementary school teacher asked her students to draw someone who changed a room without speaking. Most drew a man with a hammer pin on his chest. One captioned their picture, "He was strong because he didn't need to yell." In Detroit, a community group held a discussion called "When Silence Speaks Louder Than Words." And across countless conversations, both online and in person, a simple truth emerged. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is not speak louder, but leave space for others to listen. They replayed the moment Robert Leavitt stood, then the audience rose with him. Not because anyone asked them to, but because something unspoken demanded it. It wasn't applause for a performance. It was a quiet tribute to dignity, to presence, to truth. Jasmine Crockett returned to her work, but something in her had shifted. Her speeches began to include pauses, intentional, thoughtful breaks, inviting her audience to sit with her words. She never mentioned American voices directly, but colleagues noticed. She listened more. She interrupted less. She asked questions instead of rushing to answers. Karoline Leavitt continued in her role as White House press secretary. But now, her father appeared more often in her stories, not as a defense, but as a reminder of what it means to earn everything the hard way. When asked by a reporter what had changed after that broadcast, she answered simply, "I learned the audience isn't just the people who clap." The phrase, "someone stood up," became something of a quiet anthem. At an education conference in San Francisco, a speaker opened with it, "We don't need to argue to change things. We just need to be present." In New Orleans, an activist began printing T-shirts that read, "Hear the silence." No political campaign co-opted the moment. No party tried to claim it. It just spread, organically, like a whisper reminding people that jokes can leave scars. And silence, sometimes, can be the beginning of healing. A month later, an independent filmmaker released a short film. No dialogue, just stillness, glances, and the recreated moment Robert stood. It premiered at a festival in Austin. When it ended, the audience rose. Not because the film had concluded, but because they understood that something was just beginning. The story of Jasmine mocking Karoline is part of a joke, of Robert rising wordlessly, of silence shifting a room, reflected something far deeper than a single event. It tapped into the heart of America in 2025, in a time defined by sharp divides, casual cruelty, and hyperpolarized rhetoric. This moment reminded people, words can wound, presence can speak, and silence, when full of truth, can reshape everything. Jasmine's joke, meant to be harmless, cut deep. It touched a nerve for Robert Leavitt, a man who had spent a lifetime overlooked because he lacked connections, despite a career built with his hands in construction. He didn't respond with anger. He didn't speak at all. He just stood, and in doing so, reminded the world what quiet dignity looks like. Karoline followed his example, not by fighting back, but by sharing his story. Their combined silence and strength made everyone watching reconsider what it means to speak without harm. Jasmine's changes afterward, her 3-second pause before leaving a room, the moments of reflection in her speeches, spread through social media with the hashtag stand in silence. It wasn't a movement born of outrage. It was born of listening. And that became the lesson. In an age of instant reactions and viral mockery, we need to pause. We need to consider who's in the room. We need to understand that every word has a listener. Robert taught Karoline that opportunity isn't a joke, It's a fight, a journey, a silent endurance. And not everyone who fights for it has the voice or the platform to respond. So pause before you speak. Leave room for reflection. And choose words that don't wound. Because sometimes, as this story shows, silence speaks louder than anything else.